The rain-soaked woman stumbles through the wrought-iron gates of Ravencroft Estate, her clothes torn and muddy, desperation etched in every line of her face. Elena Morrison clutches a crumpled newspaper clipping advertising work at the remote mansion, her last hope after losing everything. She approaches the towering Gothic manor, willing to sleep in the barn, clean stables, scrub floors, anything for shelter and a chance to survive. From the shadows of the grand entrance, Adrian Blackthorne emerges. Ancient eyes that have witnessed centuries of darkness study her with predatory interest. His voice carries the weight of immortal authority when he speaks, sending shivers down her spine that have nothing to do with the cold rain. "You'll sleep next to me," he commands, his words reshaping her desperate plea into something far more dangerous. But what dark secret binds them together before they've even met? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena's journey to Ravencroft Estate had begun 3 weeks earlier when the eviction notice arrived. The small apartment she'd shared with her grandmother had been their sanctuary for 5 years, ever since Elena's parents died in that terrible car accident. But when Grandma Rose passed away last month, the medical bills and funeral expenses devoured what little savings they'd managed to accumulate. The newspaper clipping felt fragile between her trembling fingers, the ink smeared from the rain but still legible. Domestic staff wanted for private estate. Room and board provided, experience preferred but not required, serious inquiries only. The address led her through winding mountain roads to this imposing Gothic mansion that seemed to have emerged from another century. Ravencroft Estate loomed before her like something from a Victorian nightmare. Tall spires pierced the stormy sky, their weathered stone surfaces carved with gargoyles whose eyes seemed to track her movement. Stained glass windows depicting scenes she couldn't quite make out glowed with warm lamplight from within, offering the promise of warmth and shelter she desperately craved. The massive front doors were carved from dark wood and reinforced with iron bands that had turned green with age. Ivy crept up the walls, creating an intricate pattern that softened the building's harsh edges while adding to its mysterious atmosphere. Ancient oak trees flanked the approach, their branches reaching across the gravel drive like protective arms. As Elena stood there, water dripping from her sodden hair, the door opened before she could knock. A stern-faced woman in her 60s appeared, wearing a crisp black dress with a white apron that marked her as the head housekeeper. Her grey hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her sharp eyes assessed Elena with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making quick judgments about people. "You must be the girl who called about the position," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight Scottish accent. "I'm Mrs. Harwick. Come in before you catch your death." Elena stepped into a grand foyer that took her breath away. A sweeping staircase curved upward to a gallery lined with oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors. Crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows on walls adorned with rich tapestries. The marble floor was polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the warm glow of gas lamps that had been converted to electricity but maintained their antique charm. "I can clean anything," Elena said quickly, afraid this opportunity might slip away. "I'm not afraid of hard work. I can cook basic meals, tend gardens, whatever you need. I just need a place to stay and enough to survive." Mrs. Harwick's expression softened slightly at Elena's obvious desperation. "Child, you look half frozen. Come to the kitchen and we'll get some warm food into you before we discuss anything else." The kitchen was enormous, with high ceilings and copper pots hanging from wrought iron hooks. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a modern stove positioned nearby. The blend of old and new characterized the entire estate, ancient architecture accommodating contemporary necessities. Mrs. Harwick ladled soup into a porcelain bowl and set it before Elena, along with thick slices of fresh bread. The warmth spread through Elena's body, the first comfort she'd felt in weeks. "The master doesn't usually involve himself in hiring decisions," Mrs. Harwick said, settling into a chair across from Elena. "But he insisted on meeting you personally when your letter arrived. Most unusual." "That. Is he particular about his staff?" Elena asked, trying to gauge what she might be walking into. Mrs. Harwick's expression grew guarded. Mr. Blackthorne is unique. He keeps irregular hours, values privacy above all else, and expects absolute discretion from his employees. The work isn't difficult, but the household operates by certain rules that must be followed without question. Before Elena could ask what those rules might be, footsteps echoed in the corridor beyond the kitchen. Mrs. Harwick straightened in her chair, her demeanor shifting to formal attention. "That will be the master now," she whispered. "Remember what I said about discretion." The footsteps approached with measured cadence, each step deliberate and purposeful. Elena felt a strange, tingling sensation, as if the air itself had become charged with electricity. Her soup spoon trembled in her hand as anticipation and inexplicable fear warred within her chest. Adrian Blackthorne filled the doorway when he appeared, his presence commanding immediate attention. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with fluid grace that suggested coiled strength beneath his expensive dark suit. His black hair was slightly longer than current fashion, framing a face that was strikingly handsome yet somehow timeless. But it was his eyes that captured Elena's attention, deep blue, almost violet, with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to her soul. "Miss Morrison," he said, his voice rich and cultured with just a hint of an accent she couldn't place. "Welcome to Ravencroft Estate." Adrian's piercing gaze held Elena's for what felt like an eternity before he gestured for her to follow him. They walked through corridors, lined with portraits whose eyes seemed to track their movement, past suits of armor that gleamed despite their obvious age, until they reached a study that radiated old-world elegance. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes surrounded a massive mahogany desk. Behind it sat two chairs, one clearly meant for Adrian, the other positioned for visitors. But it was the documents spread across the desk's surface that commanded Elena's attention. The contract was written on parchment that felt ancient beneath her fingertips, the text flowing in elegant script that seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. The language was formal, almost archaic, filled with phrases that seemed to carry weight beyond their literal meaning. "The terms are generous," Adrian said, settling into his chair with predatory grace. "Room and board in the manor's guest quarters, not the servants' wing. Meals prepared by our chef. A monthly salary that I believe exceeds what you might find elsewhere." Elena scanned the document, trying to process the elaborate language. Phrases like "bound in service to the estate" and "subject to the master's protection and authority" seemed oddly formal for a simple employment agreement. There were clauses about discretion, loyalty, and something about responding to the call of the household that she didn't quite understand. "These provisions seem unusual," Elena said carefully. "What exactly does responding to the call of the household mean?" Adrian's lips curved in what might have been a smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Ravencroft operates differently than most households. There may be occasions when your duties extend beyond typical domestic work. Nothing improper, I assure you, but flexibility is essential." Mrs. Harwick appeared in the doorway with a silver tray bearing an ornate inkwell and what looked like an antique fountain pen. The metal gleamed with an unusual reddish tint that caught the firelight. "The special ink, sir," she said, setting the tray beside the contract. Elena noticed Mrs. Harwick's careful avoidance of eye contact as she retreated. Something about the woman's demeanor suggested this contract signing was more significant than a simple employment agreement. "I should mention," Adrian continued, "that once you sign, the agreement becomes binding in ways that standard contracts are not. You'll find yourself committed to Ravencroft in a manner that goes beyond mere employment." "What does that mean, exactly?" Adrian leaned forward, his intense gaze never wavering. "It means this estate will become your home in every sense of the word. You'll find leaving difficult, not because you're prevented from doing so, but because you won't want to." Elena's practical mind warned her that this sounded too good to be true. Employment with generous compensation, luxurious accommodations, and mysterious benefits that weren't clearly defined. But her desperation overrode caution. She had nowhere else to go, no other options, and winter was approaching. "The ink," she said, reaching for the pen. "Why is it that color?" "An old tradition," Adrian replied smoothly. "The estate has always used this particular formulation for important documents. A family recipe, you might say." The pen felt warm in her hand, almost alive. As Elena began signing her name, she felt a strange, tingling sensation that started in her fingertips and spread up her arm. The ink seemed to glow for a moment before settling into normal script. The moment her signature was complete, something shifted in the room's atmosphere. The air felt charged, electric, as if a storm was approaching. Elena felt suddenly lightheaded, her vision blurring slightly before clearing with startling sharpness. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more distinct. "Welcome to the family, Miss Morrison," Adrian said, and his voice carried new undertones that made her skin prickle with awareness. Mrs. Harwick reappeared as if summoned, though Elena hadn't heard Adrian call for her. "I'll show Miss Elena to her rooms," the housekeeper said. "She'll want to rest before dinner." As Elena stood to follow Mrs. Harwick, Adrian's voice stopped her at the door. "Elena." The use of her first name sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "Dinner is served at 8. I expect you to join me." It wasn't a request. Mrs. Harwick led Elena up the grand staircase to the second floor, past more portraits and tapestries, to a door made of polished oak. The room beyond was more luxurious than any Elena had ever seen, a four-poster bed draped in rich burgundy fabric, a sitting area with velvet chairs positioned near tall windows, and an ornate vanity that looked like it belonged in a palace. "Your belongings?" Mrs. Harwick asked. Elena gestured to the small backpack she carried everything she owned in the world. Mrs. Harwick's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. "We'll arrange for proper clothing," the housekeeper said. "For now, rest. You'll need your strength for what's coming." "What's coming?" Elena asked, but Mrs. Harwick was already closing the door. Alone in the opulent room, Elena sank onto the bed and tried to process what had just happened. The contract, the strange ink, the immediate change she'd felt upon signing, none of it made logical sense. But the alternative was returning to the streets with nothing, and that wasn't really an option at all. Elena woke to moonlight streaming through her bedroom windows, though she had no memory of falling asleep. The clock on the nightstand read midnight, and her body felt strangely energized despite the exhausting day. She'd missed dinner with Adrian, and the thought sent an unexpected pang of disappointment through her chest. Unable to return to sleep, she decided to explore the manor. Mrs. Harwick had mentioned she was free to move about the common areas, and Elena's curiosity about her new home overcame any concerns about propriety. The corridors were dimly lit by wall sconces that cast dancing shadows on the ornate wallpaper. Her bare feet made no sound on the thick Persian rugs as she made her way toward what she hoped was the library she'd glimpsed earlier. The house felt different at night, more alive somehow, as if the darkness awakened something that slumbered during daylight hours. She found the library door standing open, warm light spilling into the hallway. Inside, thousands of books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, accessible by rolling ladders that gleamed with polished brass. A fire crackled in the massive stone fireplace, casting flickering shadows across comfortable reading chairs and small tables laden with leather-bound volumes. Adrian stood with his back to the door, gazing into the flames. He'd changed from his formal suit into dark trousers and a white shirt open at the collar, the casual attire somehow making him appear even more commanding. Elena hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether to announce herself or retreat. "You couldn't sleep either," he said without turning around, his voice carrying that same hypnotic quality she'd noticed earlier. "I hope I'm not intruding." Mrs. Harwick said, "I could explore the common areas." Adrian turned to face her, and Elena's breath caught in her throat. In the firelight, his features seemed even more striking, the sharp angles of his cheekbones, the full curve of his lips, the way his dark hair caught the golden glow. But it was his eyes that held her captive, seeming to glow with their own inner light. "You're never intruding, Elena. This is your home now." He moved to a sideboard laden with crystal decanters and poured 2 glasses of what looked like wine, though the liquid seemed to shimmer with an unusual depth of color. Elena accepted the glass he offered, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The brief contact sent electricity shooting up her arm. "You missed dinner," Adrian said, settling into one of the leather chairs and gesturing for her to take the one opposite. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to sleep so long. The signing today was more exhausting than I expected. The contract affects people differently. Some adapt quickly, others need time to adjust to the changes. Elena sipped the wine, surprised by its complex flavor, rich and warming, with undertones she couldn't identify. What kind of changes? Adrian studied her over the rim of his glass, his gaze intense and calculating. Enhanced awareness, heightened senses, a connection to the estate and its inhabitants. Hell, as if to prove his point, Elena suddenly became aware of sounds she hadn't noticed before: the settling of ancient timbers, the whisper of wind through the walls, something that sounded almost like breathing in the walls themselves. The fire's warmth seemed to pulse against her skin in rhythm with her heartbeat. "The mirror," she said suddenly, noticing the ornate silver-framed mirror hanging above the mantelpiece. In its surface, she could see herself clearly, the firelight painting her features in warm gold. But Adrian's reflection was wrong, somehow. Fainter than it should be, as if he existed only partially in the mirror's world. Adrian followed her gaze and went very still. "What do you see?" Elena blinked hard, wondering if exhaustion was playing tricks with her vision. When she looked again, Adrian's reflection appeared normal, though something in his expression suggested her initial observation had been accurate. "Nothing unusual," she lied, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. Adrian set down his wineglass and moved to stand beside her chair. This close, she could smell his cologne, something expensive and sophisticated, with underlying notes that reminded her of midnight forests and winter storms. "Elena," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "there are things about this household, about me, that you'll discover gradually. I need you to trust that whatever you learn, you're safe here." She looked up at him, caught between attraction and a growing sense that she'd stepped into something far more complex than simple employment. "What kind of things?" Instead of answering directly, Adrian reached out to touch her cheek with the back of his fingers. His skin was surprisingly cool, and Elena found herself leaning into the contact, despite every rational instinct telling her to be cautious. "Some revelations can't be rushed," he murmured, "but I can promise you this: whatever I am, whatever this place holds, you belong here now." The contract ensured that. Elena felt her pulse quicken, though whether from fear or attraction, she couldn't tell. Adrian's proximity was affecting her in ways that defied logic, making her feel simultaneously protected and vulnerable, safe and in exquisite danger. "I should return to my room," she said, though the words felt hollow even to her own ears. "Of course," Adrian agreed, but neither of them moved. The fire crackled behind them, the only sound in a silence that seemed to stretch between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Finally, Elena forced herself to stand, breaking the spell that had held them both captive. "Good night, Adrian." "Good night, Elena." "Sweet dreams." As she made her way back to her room, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted between them in the library. The wine still warmed her blood, and Adrian's touch lingered on her skin like a brand. Whatever secrets Ravencroft Estate held, she was now irrevocably part of them. The next morning brought Elena's first official day of work at Ravencroft Estate. Mrs. Harwick provided a tour of the manor's various wings, explaining Elena's duties with the efficiency of someone who'd managed grand households for decades. The work was lighter than Elena had expected, dusting antique furniture, arranging fresh flowers from the estate's gardens, and helping prepare meals in the massive kitchen. But it was the forbidden areas that captured Elena's imagination. Mrs. Harwick made pointed references to sections of the manor that were off-limits. The East Wing, where Adrian's private chambers were located, certain rooms in the basement levels, and a tower accessible only through Adrian's study. "The master values his privacy above all else," Mrs. Harwick emphasized as they passed a heavy oak door marked with iron bands. "These restrictions aren't suggestions, Miss Elena, they're absolute requirements." Elena nodded her understanding, but curiosity burned within her like a living thing. The more she was told not to explore, the more she wanted to discover what lay behind those forbidden doors. Her opportunity came that afternoon when Mrs. Harwick departed for the village to purchase supplies, and Thomas, the groundskeeper, was occupied with repairs to the greenhouse. Elena found herself alone in the manor with instructions to polish the silverware in the main dining room. The task took only an hour, leaving her with time to explore before anyone returned. Elena made her way to the kitchen, then noticed a narrow staircase she hadn't seen during the morning tour. It descended into darkness, clearly leading to the basement levels Mrs. Harwick had mentioned. Elena retrieved a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and began her descent. The stairs were stone, worn smooth by centuries of use, and the air grew noticeably cooler with each step. At the bottom, she found herself in a corridor lined with heavy wooden doors, each reinforced with iron hinges that had turned black with age. The first door opened onto what appeared to be a wine cellar, with racks of bottles covered in dust that suggested decades of aging. But as Elena moved deeper into the space, she realized this wasn't an ordinary wine collection. The bottles were arranged with ritualistic precision, and many bore labels in languages she couldn't read. Some contained liquid that seemed to move on its own, swirling with patterns that defied physics. But it was the far end of the cellar that made Elena's breath catch in her throat. An altar of black stone dominated the space, carved with symbols that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. Candles surrounded the altar, their flames burning without any apparent source of ignition. At the altar's center sat an obsidian chalice that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The cup was beautiful in its darkness, carved from stone so pure it appeared to be made from crystallized night itself. As Elena approached, the chalice began to emit a faint glow, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. Unable to resist, Elena reached out to touch the rim of the chalice. The moment her fingers made contact, the world exploded into sensation. Images flooded her mind, ancient battles fought under blood-red moons, creatures with fangs and glowing eyes, rituals performed around fires that burned with supernatural flame. And through it all, she saw Adrian, not as he appeared now, but across centuries, standing over fallen enemies, commanding armies of creatures that belonged in nightmares, ruling from thrones carved from bone and shadow. But in every image, his eyes held the same intensity she'd seen in the library, the same magnetic pull that drew her despite every rational instinct. Elena snatched her hand back, gasping as the visions ceased. The chalice continued to glow for several moments before gradually returning to its normal obsidian darkness. Her legs felt weak, and she gripped the edge of the altar for support. "That chalice has been waiting for someone like you." Elena spun around to find Mrs. Harwick standing at the entrance to the cellar, her expression more knowing than surprised. The housekeeper approached with the calm stride of someone who'd expected this discovery. "Someone like me?" Elena's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Someone with the blood, child, the old blood that recognizes what others cannot see." Mrs. Harwick moved to stand beside Elena, her gaze fixed on the obsidian chalice with something approaching reverence. "What is this place? What was I seeing?" "The truth," Mrs. Harwick said simply. "This estate has been home to our kind for over 3 centuries. The chalice responds only to those who carry the ancient bloodlines, those who are meant to be part of our world." Elena felt her legs give way, and she sank onto a nearby stone bench. "Our world? What are you talking about?" Mrs. Harwick's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. "Your family name, Morrison. Where do you think it comes from, child? What do you know about your heritage, beyond your grandmother's stories?" "My parents died when I was young. Grandma Rose never talked much about the family history." Rose Morrison was a wise woman who understood the importance of keeping certain secrets. But secrets have a way of revealing themselves when the time is right. The housekeeper moved to a shelf lined with ancient books and withdrew a leather-bound volume that looked older than anything Elena had ever seen. The cover was embossed with symbols that matched those carved into the altar. "Your bloodline carries gifts, Elena, gifts that have been dormant for generations but never truly lost. The chalice recognizes what you are, even if you don't understand it yet." Elena stared at the book Mrs. Harwick offered, afraid to touch it after her experience with the chalice. "What am I?" "Someone who was always meant to find her way to Ravencroft Estate," Mrs. Harwick said. "Someone who was always meant to stand beside our master, though neither of you understands that yet." The sound of footsteps on the stone stairs announced Adrian's approach. Mrs. Harwick quickly returned the book to its shelf. but made no move to hide Elena's presence in the forbidden cellar. Adrian appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene. Elena, sitting beside the altar, the obsidian chalice still faintly glowing, Mrs. Harwick standing guard like a protector. "I see you've discovered one of our secrets," he said, his voice carrying no anger, only a kind of resigned inevitability. Adrian moved into the cellar with fluid grace, his presence immediately commanding the space. In the candlelight, his features appeared sharper, more predatory, and Elena found herself both drawn to and intimidated by the transformation. "Mrs. Harwick, perhaps you could give us some privacy," he said, though his tone made it clear this wasn't a request. The housekeeper nodded and retreated up the stairs, leaving Elena alone with Adrian beside the glowing altar. The obsidian chalice pulsed between them like a dark heart, responding to their proximity. "You have questions," Adrian said, settling onto the stone bench beside Elena, close enough that she could feel the coolness radiating from his skin, yet maintaining a careful distance that suggested restraint. "What are you?" Elena asked, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. Adrian was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the chalice. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of centuries. "I am what your kind calls a vampire, but that word carries assumptions about monsters and evil that don't capture the complexity of what we truly are." Elena felt she should be afraid, should be running toward the stairs and away from this revelation. Instead, she found herself studying Adrian's profile, searching for signs of the predator in the man who'd shown her nothing but kindness. "How old are you?" 347 years. I was turned during a winter that nearly killed half of Europe by a master who saw potential in a dying soldier." Adrian turned to face her, his violet eyes holding depths that spoke of experiences beyond human understanding. "I've spent most of those years alone, Elena, ruling territories, commanding respect through fear, maintaining the balance between our world and yours. But I've never connected with anyone the way I have with you." "The contract," Elena said, understanding beginning to dawn. "It wasn't just an employment agreement. No, it was a binding that recognizes what the chalice confirmed: you carry blood that makes you compatible with our kind. More than compatible. You're meant to be part of this world." Adrian reached into his jacket and withdrew a ring unlike anything Elena had ever seen. The band was forged from what looked like black gold, set with a stone that seemed to contain trapped starlight. Ancient symbols were etched around the band, similar to those carved into the altar. "This ring has been in my family for over 5 centuries, Adrian said. "It's worn by the alpha of our bloodline, the one who leads and protects the others. When I became alpha, I never imagined I would find someone worthy of standing beside me." Elena stared at the ring, understanding its significance even as her mind reeled with the implications. "You're asking me to become like you. I'm asking you to consider it. The choice is yours, Elena, but you should understand what you're choosing between." Adrian stood and began pacing the small space, his movements controlled but restless. "Our kind exists in a delicate balance with the human world. We have territories, alliances, enemies. As Alpha, I'm responsible for maintaining that balance, for protecting both vampires and humans from those who would upset it." "What kind of enemies?" "Other vampires who believe humans should be cattle rather than neighbors. Hunters who see no distinction between monsters and beings, trying to coexist peacefully. Ancient creatures who remember when the world was wilder and more dangerous." Adrian stopped pacing and fixed her with his intense gaze. "There are challenges coming, Elena. Political pressures within vampire society, territorial disputes, old enemies making new moves. I need someone I can trust absolutely, someone who understands both worlds." Elena rose from the bench, her legs steadier now despite the magnitude of what she was learning. "And you think that someone is me?" "The chalice thinks so, Mrs. Harwick thinks so, and my instincts, honed over 3 centuries of survival, tell me you're exactly what I've been searching for without knowing it." The obsidian chalice pulsed brighter, as if responding to the tension between them. Elena found herself drawn to it again, the visions it had shown her replaying in her memory. Adrian in battle, Adrian ruling from shadow, Adrian searching through centuries for something he couldn't name. What would it mean? Becoming like you, enhanced strength, speed, senses, near immortality, though we can be killed by specific means, a connection to others of our kind that transcends normal human relationships. Adrian moved closer, close enough that Elena could see the flecks of gold in his violet eyes. It would mean leaving your human life behind completely. There's no returning once the transformation is complete. And if I say no, then you remain human, remain here as long as you choose, under my protection. But Elena, Adrian's voice dropped to a whisper, you would be choosing a life apart from me. The connection between us is too strong for casual friendship, too intense for simple employer and employee. Elena felt the truth of his words in the way her pulse quickened whenever he was near, in the electric sensation that passed between them with every touch, in the way the supernatural elements of the estate responded to her presence. How long do I have to decide? As long as you need, but there are events in motion that may force the choice sooner than either of us would prefer. Before Elena could ask what he meant, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the stairs. But these weren't Mrs. Harwick's measured steps, they moved with supernatural speed and predatory purpose. Adrian went rigid, his entire demeanor shifting to high alert. Someone approaches who shouldn't be here. A male voice called down from the top of the stairs, carrying an accent Elena couldn't place, and an undertone of mocking amusement. Adrian, my old friend, I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but we have business to discuss. Adrian's expression hardened with recognition and what appeared to be resigned annoyance. Marcus, he called back, you're not welcome here. Oh, but I think you'll want to hear what I have to say, especially given your interesting new acquisition. Elena felt Adrian tense beside her, his protective instincts engaging in response to the implied threat. Whatever was about to happen, she realized her quiet introduction to vampire society was about to become considerably more complicated. Marcus Drakemore descended the stone steps with the confidence of someone who owned whatever space he entered. Tall and lean with platinum blonde hair that caught the candlelight, he possessed the same supernatural grace as Adrian, but wielded it with predatory arrogance rather than controlled power. His expensive suit was immaculate despite the damp cellar, and his pale green eyes assessed Elena with the calculating interest of a collector examining a rare acquisition. Adrian, you've been keeping secrets, Marcus said, his gaze never leaving Elena. When I heard whispers about a human joining your household, I had to see for myself what could capture the interest of our most famously solitary alpha. Adrian positioned himself slightly in front of Elena, a subtle but clear protective gesture. Elena is under my protection, Marcus. Your presence here violates territorial agreements. Marcus laughed, the sound echoing off the stone walls with unnatural resonance. Territorial agreements? My dear Adrian, those become rather meaningless when bloodline succession is at stake. Elena felt the tension crackling between the two vampires like electricity before a storm. Whatever history existed between them carried decades of rivalry and barely contained hostility. What are you talking about? Adrian's voice dropped to dangerous levels. Marcus moved closer to the altar, his movements deliberately casual despite the underlying threat they carried. The council has been discussing your extended bachelorhood, 3 centuries, as alpha, without producing an heir, without forming the alliances that come with proper mating. Some members question whether you're truly committed to our kind's future. The council has no authority over my personal choices, doesn't it? Marcus picked up a candle from the altar, studying the flame with affected interest. Alphas lead by example, Adrian. They form bonds that strengthen vampire society, create legacies that ensure our survival. Your isolation sets a troubling precedent. Elena found herself studying Marcus with growing unease. Unlike Adrian, whose supernatural nature felt controlled and purposeful, Marcus radiated barely restrained hunger. His pale eyes held the kind of emptiness that spoke of centuries spent viewing humans as prey rather than equals. Besides, Marcus continued, I've brought news from the Northern Territories that requires immediate alpha attention, unless of course you're too distracted by your new pet to handle your responsibilities. The insult struck its intended target. Adrian's composure cracked slightly, revealing the predator that lurked beneath his civilized exterior. Elena is not a pet. She's under my protection, which makes any threat against her a challenge to my authority. Marcus set down the candle and turned his full attention to Elena, studying her with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. Tell me, my dear, what exactly are you to our Adrian? Servant? Companion? Something more intimate? Elena lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated despite the very real danger she sensed radiating from Marcus. I'm exactly what Adrian says. I am under his protection. Ah, but protection implies vulnerability, doesn't it? What makes you so special that our most powerful alpha would risk council displeasure for a mere human? Before Elena could respond, Marcus moved with vampire speed, closing the distance between them in the blink of an eye. His cold fingers traced the air inches from her cheek, and Elena felt power radiating from him like winter frost. Such interesting blood, Marcus murmured. Old blood, with traces of something the council would find very intriguing indeed. Adrian was beside them instantly, his hand gripping Marcus's wrist with enough force that Elena heard bones creak. Enough! Marcus smiled, clearly pleased to have provoked such a reaction. She doesn't know, does she? Hasn't figured out why the old artifacts respond to her touch, why her presence affects you so strongly. That's not your concern. Everything that affects alpha stability is my concern, Adrian, especially when it involves bloodlines the council has been searching for across centuries. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cellar's temperature. What bloodlines? Marcus extracted himself from Adrian's grip with fluid grace, brushing imaginary dust from his sleeve. The Morrison family has quite a reputation in our circles, though most assumed the line had died out generations ago. Vampire hunters with the rather inconvenient ability to resist our influence and track our kind across great distances. The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Vampire hunters? Your great-great-grandmother was particularly troublesome, Marcus continued with obvious enjoyment at the chaos he was creating. Cordelia Morrison killed over 40 vampires before she mysteriously disappeared. The council assumed she'd been eliminated, but apparently she simply retired to raise a family. Adrian's expression was thunderous. Marcus, you're walking a very dangerous line. Am I? Or am I simply pointing out that our distinguished alpha has chosen to protect the descendant of one of our kind's most effective enemies? The irony is quite delicious. Elena's mind reeled as pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed began falling into place. Her grandmother's stories about family legends, the strange dreams she'd been having since arriving at Ravencroft, the way supernatural elements seemed to respond to her presence. The chalice recognized her heritage, Adrian said, his voice tight with controlled anger. Her bloodline doesn't define her choices, doesn't it? Marcus moved toward the stairs, his message clearly delivered. The council will be very interested to learn about Miss Morrison's presence here. I'm sure they'll want to interview her about any family knowledge she might possess. If the council wants to discuss Elena, they can arrange a formal meeting through proper channels. Until then, she remains under my protection on my territory. Marcus paused at the bottom of the stairs, his smile sharp enough to cut glass. Of course, Adrian, I'm sure they'll be in touch very soon. Do give my regards to your charming guest. As Marcus's footsteps faded up the stairs, Elena sank back onto the stone bench, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. Vampire hunters. My family were vampire hunters. Adrian knelt beside her, his expression gentle despite the tension still radiating from his frame. Your bloodline doesn't determine who you are, Elena. You've made your own choices, formed your own relationships. But it explains everything, doesn't it? Why the contract affected me so strongly, why I can see things others can't, why the chalice responded to my touch. It explains some things, but it doesn't explain why I feel connected to you in ways that transcend bloodline politics. Elena looked up at Adrian, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time since arriving at Ravencroft. Alpha vampire, centuries old, powerful enough to command respect from creatures she was only beginning to understand. And she was the descendant of people who had dedicated their lives to hunting his kind. What happens now? Adrian's hand found hers, his cool fingers intertwining with her warm ones. Now we prepare for whatever the council decides to do next. And Elena. His violet eyes held hers with unwavering intensity. Whatever your heritage, whatever your family's history, you belong here. You belong with me. The obsidian chalice pulsed between them, its glow reflecting off the ancient symbols carved into the altar. Elena realized that her choice between humanity and transformation had just become infinitely more complicated and infinitely more urgent. 3 days after Marcus's visit, the supernatural world began showing signs of disturbance that even Elena's newly awakened senses could detect. The estate's wildlife grew agitated, birds gathered in unusual formations, deer refused to venture near the manor's grounds, and the household's cats prowled restlessly through corridors as if sensing approaching danger. Adrian spent increasing hours in his study, receiving visitors who arrived under cover of darkness and departed before dawn. Elena caught glimpses of them through windows, beings that moved with vampire grace but carried themselves with the authority of ambassadors or generals. Mrs. Harwick confirmed Elena's suspicions with worried glances and hushed conversations that ceased whenever Elena entered a room. On the 4th morning, Adrian's behavior shifted dramatically. He appeared at breakfast with the controlled tension of someone preparing for battle, his usual elegant composure replaced by sharp alertness. When he spoke, his voice carried undertones of command that made Elena's newly sensitive nerves respond with involuntary awareness. "Elena, I need you to understand something," he said, setting down his coffee cup with deliberate precision. "The council has called an emergency session. My presence is required, and the subject under discussion is territorial stability in light of recent developments." Elena didn't need him to explain that she was the recent development in question. "When do you leave?" "Tonight. The session convenes at the Winter Solstice Gathering Ground, 300 miles north. I'll be gone for at least a week, possibly longer depending on council politics." Mrs. Harwick entered the dining room, carrying a crystal sphere about the size of a child's head, its surface swirling with patterns that seemed to move independently of any external light source. She set it carefully on the sideboard, treating it with the reverence typically reserved for religious artifacts. "The communication orb, sir," she said. "Thomas has completed the protective circles around the estate, and I've briefed the staff on emergency procedures." Elena looked between Adrian and Mrs. Harwick, understanding that preparations were being made for more than a simple business trip. "What kind of emergency procedures?" Adrian's expression grew grim. "Marcus's visit wasn't purely social. He was testing our defenses, assessing your capabilities, gathering information for others who may not share his restraint. You think they'll come here while you're gone? I think Marcus has spent decades positioning himself as my potential successor should anything happen to me. Your presence complicates his plans in ways that make you a target." The crystal orb pulsed with soft light, and Adrian moved to place his hand on its surface. The patterns within swirled faster, responding to his touch with colors that had no names in any human language. "This will allow us to communicate across any distance," he explained. "If you're in danger, if anything unusual happens, touch the orb and call my name. I'll know immediately." Elena approached the orb cautiously, remembering her reaction to the obsidian chalice. When her fingers made contact with the crystal surface, warmth spread up her arm, and images flashed through her mind. Vast halls filled with creatures that belonged in nightmares, the political gatherings where alliances were forged and broken with casual brutality. Adrian, standing before a tribunal of beings whose power made the air itself seem to thicken. "The council," she breathed, understanding flooding through her. "They're not just vampires. No, the supernatural world is more complex than popular fiction suggests. Vampires, shapeshifters, ancient spirits, beings that predate human civilization, all maintaining an uneasy balance that prevents exposure to your kind." Adrian's hand covered hers on the crystal surface, and suddenly Elena could sense his emotions through the connection. Fierce protectiveness, warring with political necessity, love struggling against the requirements of leadership. "Why can't I come with you?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. "Because presenting you to the council before you've made your choice about transformation would force decisions none of us are ready for. And because..." Adrian hesitated, his usual confidence cracking slightly. Because some of the council members would see killing the last Morrison hunter as a permanent solution to potential problems. The casual mention of her possible death sent ice through Elena's veins. And others? Others might try to recruit you, use your heritage and abilities for their own purposes. Mrs. Harwick cleared her throat diplomatically. Sir, your transportation arrives at sunset. Perhaps Miss Elena should understand the full scope of our defensive preparations. For the next several hours, Elena discovered that Ravencroft Estate was far more than a beautiful manor house. Hidden passages connected every major room. Secret chambers contained weapons that hummed with supernatural energy, and protective symbols carved into seemingly decorative elements formed a network of barriers against unwanted intrusion. Thomas, the groundskeeper, revealed himself to be considerably more than a man who tended gardens. When he demonstrated his ability to communicate with the estate's wildlife and command plant growth with gestures, Elena realized she was surrounded by protectors whose abilities complemented Adrian's vampiric power. The estate chooses its own, Thomas explained, as they walked through gardens where flowers bloomed out of season and vines moved to block potential approach routes. You belong here now, Miss Elena. The land itself will help protect you. As evening approached, Elena found herself in Adrian's study, watching him prepare for departure. He moved with economical efficiency, packing items she didn't recognize, weapons that looked ancient yet deadly, documents sealed with wax that seemed to move in the candlelight, vials containing substances that glowed with their own internal light. Adrian, Elena said as he secured the last of his traveling supplies, what if the council decides you're compromised? What if they don't let you return? He stopped what he was doing and crossed to where she stood by the window. Outside, creatures she couldn't quite see gathered in the shadows, his escort to the council gathering. Then you'll have to decide very quickly whether you want to remain human and vulnerable or embrace what you're becoming and fight for what we've built here. Adrian's hands framed her face with gentle reverence, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones as if memorizing her features. Whatever happens at the council, Elena, remember this: you changed everything for me. You gave me something worth protecting beyond duty or territory. When he kissed her, Elena tasted centuries of loneliness, finally finding resolution, power held in careful check for fear of causing harm, and love that transcended the fundamental differences in what they were. As Adrian departed into the night, surrounded by supernatural guards, Elena touched the crystal orb and felt the first stirrings of abilities she was only beginning to understand. The estate settled around her like protective arms, and she realized that whatever challenges were coming, she would face them as more than the desperate woman who'd arrived, seeking only shelter. She was becoming something new, something that belonged to both worlds. 2 nights after Adrian's departure, Elena woke to silence so complete it felt oppressive. No night sounds from the estate's wildlife. No whisper of wind through the ancient oaks, no settling groans from the manor's old timbers. Even her own heartbeat seemed muffled, as if the very air had thickened around Ravencroft. She reached for the crystal orb on her nightstand, but its usual soft glow had faded to barely perceptible light. When she touched its surface, instead of the warm connection to Adrian, she felt only cold glass. Elena dressed quickly and made her way downstairs, following instincts she didn't fully understand. In the main foyer, she found Mrs. Harwick standing motionless beside the grand staircase, her attention fixed on the front windows. Thomas emerged from the kitchen, carrying what looked like a sword that seemed to be forged from starlight itself. "How many?" Mrs. Harwick asked, without turning around. Thomas's weathered face was grim. "At least a dozen. They've surrounded the property, but they're not moving yet, waiting for something." Elena approached the window carefully, peering through heavy curtains into the estate's front grounds. At first, she saw nothing unusual: moonlight, painting the familiar landscape in silver and shadow. But as her newly enhanced vision adjusted, shapes began to resolve from the darkness. Figures stood among the oak trees, their stillness marking them as predators rather than late-night wanderers. Even at a distance, Elena could sense supernatural power radiating from them like heat from fire. They wore dark clothing that seemed to absorb light, and their positioning showed tactical awareness that spoke of military training. "Marcus," Mrs. Harwick said, her voice carrying decades of barely contained dislike. "He's brought friends." Elena spotted him then, standing boldly in the center of the circular drive, as if he owned the estate. Marcus had abandoned his earlier pretense of civility. His expression was openly predatory, and his pale eyes seemed to glow with anticipation. "What do they want?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "You, child." The council meeting was a distraction to draw Adrian away. Marcus has been planning this for months. Thomas moved to a cabinet Elena had assumed contained china, revealing instead an arsenal of weapons that hummed with supernatural energy. He selected a crossbow that seemed to be carved from bone and crystal, its surface covered in symbols that pulsed with soft light. "The estate's defenses will hold them back temporarily," he said, "but not indefinitely. They've brought specialists, beings who know how to break protective barriers." As if summoned by his words, Marcus's voice carried across the grounds with unnatural clarity, reaching them despite closed windows and solid walls. "Elena Morrison," he called, his tone carrying mock formality. "I come with greetings from the council and an invitation to discuss your family's legacy. Surely you don't want to cower inside like a frightened child when such important matters require attention." Elena felt anger flare within her, hot and sudden. The emotion brought with it something else, a tingling sensation that started in her chest and spread outward like electricity seeking ground. The sensation was familiar yet foreign, like remembering a skill learned in childhood but unused for years. "He's trying to provoke you," Mrs. Harwick warned. "Your hunter instincts respond to supernatural threats, but you're not ready for a direct confrontation." "What happens if I don't go out there?" Thomas checked the crossbow's mechanism with practiced efficiency. "They'll eventually breach the defenses and come in. At least outside, you have room to maneuver." Marcus's voice rose again, carrying new undertones of impatience. "The council has authorized me to bring you back for questioning, Elena, voluntarily or otherwise. Your cooperation would be appreciated." Elena moved away from the window, her mind racing through possibilities. She thought of Adrian facing the council hundreds of miles away, possibly unaware that his absence had triggered exactly the scenario he'd feared. The crystal orb remained dark, their communication severed by whatever forces Marcus had brought with him. "There has to be another option," she said, more to herself than to her protectors. Mrs. Harwick and Thomas exchanged glances, weighted with years of shared experience and unspoken communication. "There is," Mrs. Harwick said slowly, "but it requires you to embrace what you are instead of fighting it." Elena felt the tingling sensation intensify, responding to the implied challenge. "What do you mean?" Thomas set down his crossbow and approached one of the foyer's display cases. Inside, nestled on velvet that had faded with age, lay a dagger unlike anything Elena had ever seen. The blade seemed to be forged from silver moonlight, its edge sharp enough to cut shadow itself. The handle was wrapped in leather that had been worn smooth by generations of use, and symbols carved into the crossguard matched those she'd seen in the cellar's altar. "This belonged to your great-great-grandmother, Mrs. Harwick said. "Cordelia Morrison's hunting blade, blessed by forces that predate Christianity and tempered in waters that no longer exist." Elena stared at the weapon, understanding instinctively that touching it would change everything. The hunter heritage she'd been learning about in fragments would become fully active, bringing abilities she didn't understand, but somehow remembered. "The moment you take that blade," Thomas warned, "there's no going back to purely human. You'll be what your bloodline was always meant to produce, a bridge between worlds, capable of standing against supernatural threats but also understanding them." Outside, Marcus's patience was evidently wearing thin. Elena heard sounds of movement, his followers beginning to test the estate's defensive barriers. Sparks of supernatural energy flashed among the trees as protective spells resisted intrusion. Elena reached for the dagger, her hand steady despite the magnitude of the decision. The moment her fingers closed around the handle, the world exploded into sensation. Power flooded through her like lightning striking water, awakening instincts and abilities that had lain dormant for generations. She could suddenly sense every supernatural creature on the property, feel their individual power signatures like distinct musical notes forming a complex chord. Marcus's vampiric strength, his followers' varied abilities, even Mrs. Harwick and Thomas's protective magic, all of it mapped itself in her awareness with crystal clarity. But more than that, she could feel the estate itself responding to her transformation. The protective barriers strengthened, drawing power from her newly awakened heritage. Plants began moving with purpose, vines emerging from the earth to entangle intruders. Even the ancient stones of the manor seemed to pulse with renewed vitality. Elena looked at Mrs. Harwick and Thomas with eyes that now saw layers of reality invisible to normal human perception. I understand now. This is what Adrian sensed in me from the beginning. Outside, Marcus's confident posture had shifted to wary attention. Even he could sense the change in the estate's defenses, the awakening of power he'd hoped to avoid. Elena moved toward the front door, the blessed dagger comfortable in her grip, as if she'd carried it all her life. Let's see what the council's representative really wants to discuss. Elena stepped onto the manor's front portico with the blessed dagger at her side, her newly awakened senses mapping the tactical situation with startling clarity. Marcus's forces had positioned themselves in a classic encirclement pattern, but their confidence had wavered noticeably since her transformation. The estate's renewed defenses created visible barriers of shimmering energy that made several of his followers step back nervously. Marcus himself stood in the circular drive, his platinum hair catching moonlight as he studied Elena with reassessing eyes. The casual arrogance he'd displayed during his cellar visit had been replaced by wary respect for power he hadn't anticipated encountering. "Well," he said, his voice carrying across the space between them with supernatural clarity, "it seems the Morrison bloodline has more surprises than even the council suspected. That's quite an impressive awakening, my dear." Elena descended the front steps with measured confidence, the dagger's power flowing through her like a constant electric current. Every movement felt enhanced, every sense heightened to levels that made the night landscape appear bright as day. "What do you want, Marcus?" "Originally, to bring you to the council for questioning about your family's hunting techniques and supernatural knowledge. But now." His smile held genuine appreciation mixed with calculation. "Now I'm wondering if there might be more profitable arrangements to explore." Elena's enhanced awareness detected movement among the trees as Marcus's followers adjusted their positions, but instead of tightening their encirclement, they seemed to be preparing for retreat. Her transformation had shifted the power balance more dramatically than anyone had expected. Profitable for whom? Marcus began walking slowly around the drive's perimeter, maintaining careful distance while studying Elena from different angles. "The council fears you because of what your ancestors did to our kind, but I see opportunity where they see threat." He gestured toward his concealed followers with casual authority. "These vampires follow me because I offer them something Adrian never has: the promise of evolution rather than stagnation. Your abilities could help us achieve that evolution." So, Elena's grip tightened on the dagger's handle as understanding dawned. "You want to use my hunter heritage against other vampires. Not against, my dear. Imagine combining vampire strength with hunter tracking abilities, supernatural speed with the capacity to sense our kind's weaknesses. We could become something unprecedented." The suggestion sent cold revulsion through Elena's newly awakened instincts. Using her abilities to hunt vampires felt like betraying everything she'd discovered about Adrian and their connection. But Marcus wasn't finished with his proposal. "Consider the alternative," he continued, his tone shifting to mild threat. "Adrian returns from the council to find you dead, killed while bravely defending his estate. Tragic, but these things happen during territorial disputes. The council accepts my report with appropriate regret." Elena felt power surge through her in response to the implied threat, the dagger's blade beginning to emit soft silver light. The estate's protective barriers flared brighter, and she sensed rather than saw plants throughout the grounds, responding to her emotional state. "Or," Marcus said, noting her defensive reaction with apparent satisfaction, "you come with me willingly, and we explore what partnership between our kinds might accomplish. Adrian need never know what really happened here." Before Elena could respond, the crystal orb in her pocket suddenly blazed with warmth. Despite Marcus's interference with supernatural communications, her emotional surge had apparently broken through whatever barriers he'd established. Adrian's voice reached her mind with urgent clarity. Asterisk Elena, I'm coming. Whatever's happening, hold on. Asterisk. The connection lasted only seconds, but Elena felt strength flow into her from across the hundreds of miles separating them. Adrian had sensed her danger and was somehow breaking away from the council to return to her. Marcus's expression darkened as he recognized the signs of restored communication. How touching. Adrian abandons his political responsibilities to rush home to his pet human. The council will be most interested in this demonstration of compromised priorities. Elena stepped forward, the dagger's light intensifying with her growing confidence. I'm not human anymore, Marcus, and I'm not Adrian's pet. I'm something you clearly don't understand. Marcus's followers emerged from concealment as tension escalated, their supernatural forms becoming visible in the dagger's growing radiance. Elena counted 12 vampires, each carrying weapons that hummed with dark energy. But instead of feeling overwhelmed, her hunter instincts catalogued their individual weaknesses with computer-like precision. Perhaps a demonstration is in order, Marcus said, drawing a blade that seemed to be forged from crystallized darkness. Let's see how much of your great-great-grandmother's skill you've inherited. Elena felt the estate respond to her emotional state as Marcus approached. Ancient oak trees began creaking and groaning, their branches reaching toward the confrontation like gnarled fingers. Vines erupted from the earth around Marcus's feet, and the very stones of the drive began to glow with protective energy. But it was the dagger in Elena's hand that commanded her attention. The weapon felt alive, pulsing with power that connected her to generations of Morrison hunters. Through that connection, she sensed knowledge and skills that had been passed down through bloodline memory techniques for fighting supernatural creatures, understanding of their vulnerabilities, strategies developed across centuries of conflict. Marcus raised his dark blade with fluid vampire grace, but Elena moved to meet him with speed that surprised them both. The blessed silver of her weapon met his crystallized darkness in a shower of sparks that illuminated the night like fireworks. As they circled each other in the drive, Elena realized this wasn't just a fight between vampire and hunter. It was a test of everything she'd become since signing Adrian's contract, a proving ground for the choice between the desperate woman who'd arrived seeking shelter and the protector she was becoming. The outcome would determine not just her survival, but the future of everything she'd learned to love about her new life at Ravencroft Estate. Marcus struck with supernatural speed, but Elena's enhanced reflexes allowed her to deflect his attack while countering with moves that seemed to flow from genetic memory. The dagger sang through the air, its blessed silver leaving trails of light that lingered like after-images. Impressive, Marcus admitted as they broke apart after the first exchange. But let's see how you handle multiple opponents. He gestured to his followers, and Elena realized the real test was just beginning. The first vampire reached Elena before Marcus had finished his gesture, moving with inhuman speed that would have been invisible to normal human eyes. But Elena's awakened hunter senses tracked his approach with perfect clarity, allowing her to sidestep his attack and drag the blessed dagger across his extended arm in one fluid motion. The vampire's scream echoed across the estate grounds as holy silver burned through supernatural flesh. He staggered backward, clutching his wounded arm as wisps of smoke rose from the cut. The other attackers hesitated, suddenly understanding that Elena was far more dangerous than they'd anticipated. Marcus's expression shifted from confident amusement to genuine concern. Interesting. You're not just awakened, you're fully activated. I may have underestimated the Morrison bloodline. Two more vampires approached from opposite sides, forcing Elena to divide her attention. The dagger seemed to guide her movements, its power flowing through her like liquid lightning. She spun between her attackers, the blessed blade leaving trails of silver fire as it found supernatural flesh with unerring accuracy. But Elena quickly realized that despite her enhanced abilities, she was still facing overwhelming odds. 12 vampires, even wounded ones, possessed strength and speed that pushed her new skills to their limits. For every attacker she drove back, two more pressed forward. Mrs. Harwick appeared on the manor's front steps, her hands raised as she began chanting in a language that predated English. The estate's protective barriers flared brighter in response, creating walls of energy that blocked several vampires from reaching Elena. But the barriers were meant to keep intruders out, not contain a battle within the grounds. Thomas emerged from around the side of the manor, his starlight sword gleaming as he moved to flank Marcus's forces. Elena felt gratitude surge through her as she realized she wasn't fighting alone. The estate's protectors were risking themselves to give her tactical advantage. Marcus parried Thomas's first attack with his dark blade, their weapons ringing together with sounds that seemed to come from different dimensions. Sparks of conflicting energy cascaded around them as light fought darkness in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "You cannot protect her forever," Marcus called to Thomas as they circled each other. "The council has already declared her a threat to supernatural security. This estate will fall, with or without my intervention." Elena felt a chill at his words, understanding that tonight's attack was just the beginning of larger conflicts. But before she could process the implications, three vampires coordinated an assault that overwhelmed her defensive capabilities. The first vampire's claws raked across her shoulder, tearing through fabric and flesh with supernatural sharpness. Elena gasped in pain but managed to drive her dagger into his chest, the blessed silver causing him to burst into flames that consumed his form in seconds. The second attacker struck while Elena was still recovering from the first, his enhanced strength sending her sprawling across the gravel drive. Her grip on the dagger loosened, and the weapon skittered away across the stones. As Elena struggled to reach her fallen weapon, the third vampire moved in for what appeared to be a killing blow. But instead of claws or fangs, she felt strong arms lifting her to safety with familiar gentleness. Adrian had returned. His presence on the battlefield changed everything instantly. The attacking vampires fell back in recognition of alpha authority, their confidence evaporating in the face of power that dwarfed their own. Even Marcus straightened to attention, his casual arrogance replaced by wary respect. Adrian set Elena gently on her feet, his hands checking her wounds with tender efficiency before his attention turned to Marcus with deadly focus. "You have violated territorial agreements, threatened beings under my protection, and attacked my estate," Adrian said, his voice carrying undertones of power that made the very air seem to thicken. "Explain yourself quickly, or face the consequences of challenging an alpha on his own ground." Marcus raised his hands in a gesture of temporary surrender, though his dark blade remained ready. "The council authorized investigation of security threats. Miss Morrison's heritage presents unprecedented dangers that require—" "The council authorized nothing," Adrian interrupted, producing a scroll sealed with symbols that glowed with official authority. "I have their written acknowledgement that Elena Morrison is under my protection pending formal evaluation. Your actions here constitute rebellion against council authority." Elena watched the exchange with growing understanding of vampire politics. Adrian had somehow maneuvered the council into a position where protecting her aligned with their own interests, making Marcus's attack not just territorial violation, but political treason. Marcus's followers began backing away as the implications became clear. Attacking an alpha was one thing, challenging the council's authority was something else entirely. "This isn't over," Marcus said, his retreat disguised as tactical withdrawal. "The Morrison bloodline represents dangers that transcend political maneuvering. Others will see that even if you cannot." As Marcus and his surviving followers melted back into the darkness, Adrian turned his full attention to Elena. His hands framed her face with infinite gentleness, his violet eyes searching for signs of injury or trauma. "Are you hurt badly?" Elena shook her head, suddenly aware that her wounds were already beginning to heal with supernatural speed. "The dagger," she said, remembering her grandmother's weapon. "It awakened something in me." Adrian retrieved the blessed blade from where it had fallen, studying its silver radiance with expressions that cycled through surprise, understanding, and something that might have been pride. "You've fully activated your hunter heritage," he said, offering the weapon back to her. "This changes everything, Elena. You're not just human with supernatural potential anymore, you're something entirely new." Elena accepted the dagger, feeling its power settle into her like a missing piece of herself. "What am I?" Adrian's smile held wonder and deep affection. "You're exactly what I've been searching for across 3 centuries without knowing it. A bridge between worlds, capable of standing beside me as an equal rather than someone I need to protect." Mrs. Harwick and Thomas approached, their expressions showing relief mixed with concern for what Elena's transformation might mean for their quiet existence. "The estate's defenses will need strengthening," Mrs. Harwick observed. "Marcus won't give up easily, and others will follow his example." Adrian nodded, but his attention remained focused on Elena. "We'll deal with future threats as they arise. Tonight, we celebrate the fact that Elena has become everything she was meant to be." As dawn approached, Elena stood surrounded by beings who had become her chosen family, holding a weapon that connected her to generations of protectors, feeling power flow through her that made her a match for supernatural threats. For the first time since arriving at Ravencroft Estate, she felt truly at home. 3 weeks after Marcus's attack, Elena discovered that her transformation had attracted attention from far more dangerous sources than ambitious vampires seeking political advantage. The first sign came when she found Thomas standing motionless in the greenhouse, his weathered hands pressed against ancient stone carvings that had begun glowing with ominous red light. "What is it?" Elena asked, approaching the carved calendar that Thomas studied with growing concern. "Blood moon," he said, his voice heavy with implications she didn't yet understand. "The first one in 73 years, and it arrives in just 2 weeks. Elena traced the intricate symbols with her fingertips, feeling power pulse beneath the stone surface. Her enhanced senses detected layers of meaning carved into the ancient calendar, astronomical calculations intertwined with supernatural prophecy, warnings written in languages that predated recorded history. "Why does a blood moon matter?" Mrs. Harwick appeared in the greenhouse doorway, her expression more troubled than Elena had ever seen. "Because it amplifies all supernatural abilities tenfold, child. Every vampire becomes stronger, every magical creature more powerful, every protective barrier more effective. But it also awakens things that sleep during normal times." Adrian emerged from behind the greenhouse's towering tomato plants, his movements carrying the controlled tension Elena had learned to recognize as his response to serious threats. In his hands, he carried documents that looked older than the manor itself. "I received these this morning through council channels," he said, spreading the parchments across Thomas's workbench. "Reports from every supernatural territory on the continent. Something ancient is stirring, and it's moving toward our region with purpose." Elena studied the documents, her newly awakened abilities allowing her to read languages she'd never encountered. The reports described disturbances that sounded like natural disasters, but followed patterns too deliberate for coincidence. Forests withering overnight, rivers changing course without geological explanation, wildlife fleeing in massive migrations that left entire regions eerily silent. "What kind of ancient something?" Elena asked, though her hunter instincts were already providing uncomfortable answers. Adrian's finger traced a path across a map that showed the disturbances converging on their location like ripples moving backward through water. Vladric the Ancient. The first vampire, the one who created our kind through methods that modern vampires prefer to forget. Mrs. Harwick moved to a cabinet Elena hadn't noticed before, retrieving books that seemed to be bound in materials she didn't want to identify. He was banished centuries ago through a ritual that required the combined power of every supernatural council on Earth. The binding was supposed to be permanent. What changed? Elena felt ice forming in her stomach as implications became clear. Thomas gestured toward the stone calendar, its red glow pulsing like a heartbeat. "The blood moon breaks ancient bindings. And your awakening, combined with Adrian's territorial strength, has created exactly the kind of power signature that could serve as an anchor for Vladric's return." Elena sank onto a nearby gardening stool, the weight of responsibility settling over her like a physical burden. "He's coming here because of me." "He's coming here because of us," Adrian corrected, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "Your abilities combined with mine represent something Vladric needs for his return to permanence. Separately, we're formidable. Together, we're exactly what he's been searching for. Adrian moved to stand behind Elena, his hands settling on her shoulders with gentle support. But we're also the key to stopping him. Your hunter heritage carries knowledge of weaknesses that predate his power, and my position as Alpha gives us access to allies who understand the stakes. Mrs. Harwick opened one of the ancient books, revealing pages covered with illustrations that seemed to move when Elena wasn't looking directly at them. The original binding ritual required representatives from every major supernatural faction. Vampires, shapeshifters, ancient spirits, elemental guardians, and... She paused meaningfully. Hunters whose bloodlines carried the blessing of forces older than recorded history. Elena understood immediately. Morrison hunters weren't just vampire killers, they were participants in supernatural balance. Your great-great-grandmother didn't disappear after killing 40 vampires, Thomas said. She helped perform the binding ritual that banished Vladric. The Morrison line has been guardians as much as hunters. Adrian retrieved another document from his collection, this one sealed with symbols that hurt Elena's eyes to look at directly. The Council has authorized reformation of the original alliance. Representatives from every faction are gathering here at Ravencroft for the Blood Moon. Elena felt her pulse quicken as the magnitude of what they were planning became clear. Here? Why here? Because this estate sits on one of the world's most powerful convergence points, Mrs. Harwick explained. Supernatural energy flows through the land like underground rivers, making it ideal for both binding rituals and, she hesitated, anchoring returns from banishment. Thomas moved to the greenhouse windows, checking protective symbols that had been carved into the frame. Vladric knows this place. He's been here before, during the original binding. He understands its power better than anyone alive. Elena stood and walked to the center of the greenhouse, feeling energy pulse beneath her feet in patterns that matched the blood moon calendar. The blessed dagger at her side responded to the flowing power, its silver radiance growing brighter as supernatural forces gathered momentum. How long do we have to prepare? Adrian consulted the astronomical calculations Thomas had been studying. 2 weeks until the blood moon reaches full power. Representatives from the allied factions begin arriving tomorrow. Elena looked around at the 3 beings who had become her family, understanding that the quiet life she'd been building at Ravencroft was about to be tested in ways none of them could fully anticipate. What do I need to know about binding rituals? Mrs. Harwick's smile held both pride and concern. Everything your bloodline forgot, child. But don't worry, 2 weeks is exactly enough time to remember what the Morrison line was always meant to do. As if in response to her words, the stone calendar pulsed with brighter red light, and Elena felt power stirring in the earth beneath the estate. Whatever was coming would test every skill she'd developed, every relationship she'd formed, and every choice she'd made since arriving desperate and rain-soaked at Ravencroft's gates. But for the first time since learning about supernatural politics and ancient enemies, Elena felt ready for the challenge. She was no longer the desperate woman seeking shelter. She was a guardian, preparing to protect everything she'd learned to love. The representatives began arriving at sunset, emerging from the forest surrounding Ravencroft Estate like figures from Elena's most fantastic dreams. She watched from the manor's upper windows as beings she'd only encountered in folklore materialized from shadows and took solid form on the estate's grounds. The first delegation consisted of 3 shapeshifters who approached in their animal forms: a massive wolf with silver-tipped fur, a golden eagle whose wingspan dwarfed any natural bird, and a black bear whose intelligent eyes reflected centuries of accumulated wisdom. As they reached the circular drive, their forms shimmered and reformed into human shapes, though they retained an otherworldly grace that marked them as fundamentally different from ordinary people. Adrian met them at the front door with formal ceremony, speaking words in languages Elena didn't recognize while presenting symbols of safe passage and alliance. The exchange felt ritualistic, heavy with traditions that stretched back to the origins of supernatural cooperation. The second group arrived through methods that defied physics entirely. Elena felt the air in the great hall shift and thicken, charged with energy that made her newly awakened senses tingle. Three figures simply materialized in the center of the room, elemental guardians whose forms seemed to be composed of living force rather than flesh and bone. The water guardian appeared as a woman whose skin held the blue-green depths of ocean trenches, her hair flowing in currents that followed no earthly wind. The Earth Guardian manifested as a man whose body seemed carved from living stone, moss, and small flowers growing from the cracks in his granite skin. The Air Guardian flickered between solid and translucent, her form shifting like heat mirages, while her voice carried the sound of wind through mountain passes. Mrs. Harwick handled the formal introductions with diplomatic skill Elena hadn't known she possessed, presenting each delegation with gifts that sparkled with supernatural significance. But it was the arrival of the third group that tested Elena's understanding of what alliance truly meant. They came at full darkness, their approach announced by a chill that seemed to emanate from spaces between stars. 5 ancient spirits materialized on the estate's grounds, beings so old they remembered when the world was young, when magic flowed openly and humans cowered in caves before forces they couldn't comprehend. Their leader appeared as a tall figure draped in shadows that moved independently of any light source. When it spoke, its voice carried the weight of millennia and the coldness of cosmic void. "We come because the binding must hold," it said, addressing Adrian with the tone of an equal speaking to someone significantly younger. "But we question whether flesh and blood can succeed where pure power might fail." Elena descended the grand staircase to join the gathering, the blessed dagger at her side, responding to the concentrated supernatural energy with steady silver radiance. Every eye, physical and otherwise, turned to assess her as she approached. "You are the Morrison heir," the shadow-draped spirit observed. "Your bloodline participated in the original binding, but you are untested in the ways that matter most." Elena felt the challenge in its words, understanding that these alliances would be based on demonstrated capability rather than inherited reputation. What kind of test? The Earth Guardian stepped forward, his stone features arranging themselves into what might have been a smile. "Show us that you can channel the forces necessary for ritual work. Prove that flesh can contain the power required to bind what should not exist." Thomas appeared beside Elena, carrying a scroll that seemed to be written on material that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. "The testing ground has been prepared in the estate's heart," he said, "where the energy flows converge most strongly." Elena followed the assembled delegates through corridors she'd never seen before, past doorways that opened onto rooms that couldn't possibly fit within the manor's exterior dimensions. They descended stairs that seemed to spiral deeper than the estate's foundations could support, until they emerged into a vast underground chamber that pulsed with concentrated supernatural force. At the chamber's center, a circle had been carved into the stone floor using symbols that belonged to no single magical tradition. Each mark represented a different supernatural faction, their combined power creating patterns that made Elena's enhanced vision struggle to process the complexity. "Stand at the circle's heart," the Water Guardian instructed, her oceanic voice echoing off chamber walls that seemed to stretch beyond sight. "Channel your heritage through the convergence point. If you can contain and direct the energy without being consumed, you may be worthy of alliance." Elena stepped into the carved circle, immediately feeling power rush up from the earth beneath her feet. The sensation was like being struck by lightning that continued flowing through her body, building in intensity until she thought her bones might crack from the pressure. But instead of being overwhelmed, Elena found herself remembering techniques that belonged to bloodline memory rather than personal experience. Her hands moved in patterns she'd never learned, directing energy flows with instincts inherited from generations of Morrison guardians. The blessed dagger began glowing brighter, its silver radiance growing until it illuminated the entire chamber. Through the weapon, Elena felt connected to every supernatural being present, their individual power signatures harmonizing into a complex symphony of forces that could reshape reality itself. Impressive, the shadow spirit acknowledged as Elena maintained control over energies that should have destroyed any mortal form. The bloodline remembers what it was trained to do. Adrian stepped to the circle's edge, his expression showing pride mixed with awe. "The alliance is confirmed. We have 13 days to prepare the binding ritual." Elena felt the assembled powers settle around her like protective armor, understanding that she'd passed more than a simple test. These beings had accepted her as an equal partner in work that would determine the fate of both supernatural and human worlds. But as the energy flows gradually subsided, Elena also sensed something else stirring in response to their gathering, a dark presence that had felt their combined power and was now moving toward them with increased urgency. Vladrik knew they were preparing to face him, and he was no longer content to approach at measured pace. Vladrik the Ancient arrived 3 days before the blood moon reached its full power, his presence announced by phenomena that defied natural law. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in minutes, frost forming on windows despite the late autumn warmth. Every electronic device within 10 miles failed simultaneously, and wildlife fled the region in panicked waves that left the countryside eerily silent. Elena felt his approach long before any physical manifestation appeared. Her hunter senses detected a wrongness in the world's fabric, as if reality itself recoiled from something that shouldn't exist. The blessed dagger at her side grew cold enough to burn, its silver radiance flickering with patterns that suggested distress rather than power. From the manor's upper windows, Elena watched darkness gather in ways that had nothing to do with sunset. Shadows pooled among the trees without regard for light sources, and the very air seemed to thicken with malevolent intent. When Vladrik finally materialized on the estate's grounds, she understood why the original binding had required the combined efforts of every supernatural faction. He appeared as a figure carved from crystallized darkness, standing over 7 feet tall, with features that suggested classical sculpture twisted by centuries of accumulated evil. His eyes burned with red fire that left afterimages when Elena blinked, and his presence warped space around him like gravity distorted by massive weight. But it was the scepter he carried that commanded Elena's horrified attention. The weapon seemed to be forged from compressed suffering, its surface covered with faces that moved and screamed in silent agony. Dark energy cascaded from its tip like liquid shadow, and Elena's enhanced senses detected power that could unmake reality itself. "Scepter of Dominion," Adrian said, appearing beside Elena at the window. His voice carried centuries of accumulated fear despite his efforts to remain calm. With that weapon, he can control any supernatural being within miles. It's how he built his original empire. Elena watched Vladrik survey the estate with the casual authority of someone reclaiming property rather than invading hostile territory. "How do we fight something like that?" "We don't fight him directly," Adrian replied. "We complete the binding ritual before he can establish permanent anchor in our reality." "But Elena," his voice carried weights she didn't want to acknowledge, "if the ritual fails, if he gains full power during the blood moon, I need you to run. Get as far from here as possible and never look back." Elena turned from the window to face Adrian, seeing vulnerability in his expression that she'd never encountered before. "I'm not leaving you. You may not have a choice. Vladrik's return isn't random. He's specifically seeking the combination of vampire, alpha power, and awakened hunter bloodline. Together, we represent everything he needs to break the barriers between supernatural and human worlds permanently." Before Elena could respond, the manor's protective barriers flared with warning light. Vladrik had begun testing their defenses, his scepter sending tendrils of dark energy against the estate's ancient protections. Where the attacks struck, reality wavered like heat mirages, showing glimpses of landscapes that belonged to nightmares. Mrs. Harwick's voice echoed through the manor via supernatural communication, reaching every member of their assembled alliance simultaneously. "He's brought companions, beings that were banished with him, now freed to serve as his advance force." Elena moved to a different window, her enhanced vision revealing creatures that emerged from the darkness surrounding Vladrik. They appeared as twisted amalgamations of various supernatural species, vampires with too many teeth, shapeshifters locked in partial transformation, spirits whose forms flickered between solid and ethereal while radiating hunger that felt like physical weight. "How many?" Adrian asked, his tactical mind already assessing the threat. Thomas's voice joined Mrs. Harwick's supernatural communication network. "Dozens, maybe more, emerging from whatever realm he's been imprisoned in. They're surrounding the estate, but they're not attacking yet. Elena felt her pulse quicken as understanding dawned. He's waiting for something. The blood moon's peak power, Adrian confirmed. 3 days from now, when supernatural forces reach their maximum strength, he'll use that amplification to break our defenses and complete whatever ritual he needs for permanent return. The shadow spirit materialized beside them without warning, its ancient form flickering with agitation. The binding circle must be prepared immediately. We cannot wait for optimal lunar conditions if he's brought an army. Elena nodded, understanding that their careful preparations would need to accelerate dramatically. What do you need me to do? Channel power through the convergence point while we establish the primary binding matrix, the spirit replied. But understand, once the ritual begins, you'll be drawing Vladrik's full attention. He'll do everything possible to stop us. Adrian's hand found Elena's, his cool fingers intertwining with her warm ones. Are you ready for this? Elena looked out at the dark army gathering around their sanctuary, feeling the weight of responsibility for both supernatural and human worlds settling over her shoulders. But alongside the fear, she felt something else: determination forged through weeks of transformation, love worth fighting for, and the inherited strength of generations who had faced similar choices. I'm ready, she said, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. The blessed dagger pulsed with renewed radiance as if responding to her resolve, and Elena felt power flow through her that connected her to every Morrison hunter who had stood against supernatural threats across the centuries. Whatever Vladrik had planned, whatever the cost of opposing him, Elena knew she was exactly where she belonged, standing beside Adrian, surrounded by allies who had become family, preparing to defend everything that mattered. The shadow spirit's form solidified with approval. Then we begin the binding. May the powers that shape this world grant us strength for what we must do. As the assembled alliance moved toward the convergence chamber, Elena felt the approaching blood moon pulling at forces within her that she was only beginning to understand. In 3 days, everything would be decided: the fate of supernatural balance, the future of her relationship with Adrian, and whether the Morrison bloodline would fulfill its ancient purpose one final time. But tonight, surrounded by beings who had accepted her as both hunter and guardian, Elena felt ready to face whatever darkness awaited them. The blood moon reached its zenith at precisely midnight, bathing Ravencroft Estate in crimson light that transformed the familiar landscape into something from the depths of mythology. Elena stood at the center of the binding circle in the convergence chamber, power flowing through her in waves that would have destroyed her human form weeks earlier. But her awakened heritage allowed her to channel forces that reshaped reality itself. Around the circle's perimeter, representatives from every supernatural faction maintained their positions with grim determination. The shadow spirit flickered between dimensions as it wove binding energies through patterns older than human civilization. The elemental guardians anchored the ritual to fundamental forces of earth, air, fire, and water. Shapeshifters held the boundaries between worlds stable while their forms shifted in response to magical pressure. Adrian stood directly opposite Elena across the circle's diameter, his vampire nature fully manifest as he channeled 3 centuries of accumulated power into the binding matrix. His eyes blazed with supernatural fire, and dark energy cascaded around him like living shadow, responding to his will. Above them, the chamber's ceiling had become transparent to reveal the blood moon hanging like a malevolent eye in the star-scattered sky. Its crimson radiance poured down into the convergence point, amplifying every magical working beyond normal limitations. But the ritual's progress was measured against time running out. Through the chamber's stone walls, Elena could feel Vladrik's assault on the estate's defenses intensifying with each passing moment. His scepter sent waves of corruption against protective barriers that had stood for centuries, and his army of twisted creatures pressed closer to the manor with supernatural persistence. The binding matrix is 70% complete, the shadow spirit announced, its voice carrying across dimensions as it worked. But he's breaking through the outer defenses faster than anticipated. Elena felt sweat beading on her forehead despite the chamber's coolness as she maintained her connection to the convergence point. The energy flowing through her was like trying to contain a river with her bare hands, possible through force of will, but requiring every ounce of concentration she possessed. "How much longer?" Adrian called across the circle, his own strain evident in the tightness around his eyes. "Minutes, not hours," the Earth Guardian replied, his stone features creased with effort. "But the final phase requires—" His words were cut off as the chamber shook with impacts that suggested Vladrik's forces had reached the manor itself. Dust rained from ancient stones, and several of the carved symbols along the walls flickered as protective energies were redirected to resist assault. Elena heard Mrs. Harwick's voice echo through supernatural communication. "He's in the manor. Thomas and I are falling back to the final defensive positions, but we can't hold him long." Through the binding circle's connection, Elena suddenly felt Vladrik's presence like ice water in her veins. His power was vast, ancient, and utterly corrupted by centuries of feeding on suffering. Worse, she sensed his attention focusing on the chamber below, drawn by the massive energies their ritual was generating. "He knows where we are," Elena said, fighting to maintain her position as terror threatened to break her concentration. The Water Guardian's oceanic voice carried new urgency. "The matrix is unstable. If we lose channeling focus now, the binding will collapse, and he'll be permanently anchored to this reality." Adrian's gaze found Elena's across the circle, and she saw love warring with desperate determination in his expression. "Whatever happens, don't break the connection until the binding is complete." Elena nodded, understanding that Adrian was preparing to leave the ritual to face Vladrik directly, a confrontation that would almost certainly cost him his existence, but might buy them the time needed to finish their work. Before Adrian could move, the chamber's entrance exploded inward in a shower of stone and dark energy. Vladrik stood framed in the opening, his massive form radiating malevolence that made the very air difficult to breathe. The scepter of dominion pulsed with power that sent several alliance members staggering backward. "How touching," Vladrik said, his voice carrying the weight of geological ages. "The Great Alliance attempts to repeat their ancient success. But you've made a critical error in your calculations." Elena felt his attention focus on her like a physical weight, and the blessed dagger at her side grew so cold it burned through her clothing. "You brought me exactly what I needed, little hunter." Morrison blood awakened to its full potential, freely offered in a convergent circle during the blood moon's peak. "I couldn't have arranged better circumstances myself." Understanding struck Elena like lightning. "You wanted us to gather here. You wanted the binding ritual." Vladrik's smile revealed teeth like obsidian daggers. "The original binding required Morrison participation to contain my power. But a binding circle works both ways. What contains can also absorb. Your bloodline's energy, combined with the Alpha's strength and channeled through this convergence point, will make me stronger than I ever was before banishment." The scepter of dominion began drawing energy from the binding circle itself, corrupting their careful work and turning it to Vladrik's purpose. Elena felt power being pulled from her in ways that threatened to drain her life force entirely. "The heart of eternity," the shadow spirit called out desperately. "It's our only chance to reverse the corruption." Elena saw Adrian reach into his jacket and withdraw a gem that seemed to contain captured starlight. The heart of eternity, a legendary artifact that could grant immortality or restore mortality, reshape supernatural nature or preserve human essence. But using it would require someone to make the ultimate choice between transcendence and sacrifice, knowing that whatever decision they made would determine not only their own fate, but the future of both supernatural and human worlds. Elena looked at Adrian across the corrupted binding circle, seeing the same realization in his eyes. One of them would have to use the heart of eternity to break Vladrik's hold on their ritual, and the cost would be everything they'd built together. The blood moon pulsed overhead, Vladrik's laughter echoed through the chamber, and Elena felt time running out as the choice between love and duty approached with inexorable certainty. Elena reached for the heart of eternity before Adrian could move, her hunter instincts recognizing what needed to be done. The gem felt warm in her palm despite its crystalline appearance, pulsing with power that resonated through her awakened bloodline like a tuning fork struck against her soul. "Elena, no!" Adrian shouted across the corrupted binding circle, but Vladrik's scepter sent waves of dark energy that prevented him from reaching her. "You cannot stop what has already begun," Vladrik declared, his ancient voice echoing off chamber walls as he drew more power from their ritual. "The Morrison bloodline will serve my return just as it once served my binding." Elena felt the heart of eternity growing warmer in her grip, its power responding to her desperate need for a solution that could save everyone she loved. Through the gem's connection, she suddenly understood its true nature, not just an artifact that granted choices between mortality and immortality, but a conduit that could reshape supernatural reality itself. "The heart doesn't just change individuals," she called to Adrian, her voice carrying new certainty. "It can rewrite the fundamental laws that govern supernatural existence." The shadow spirit flickered with sudden comprehension. "She means to alter the binding itself. Instead of containing Vladrik, she's going to unmake the power that sustains him." Vladrik's expression shifted from triumphant certainty to alarmed understanding. "Impossible. The forces that created me are older than your world's formation. They cannot be simply erased." Elena pressed the heart of eternity against her chest, feeling its power flow into her through pathways opened by her awakened heritage. "Maybe not erased," she said, strength building in her voice as cosmic forces answered her call. "But they can be redirected." Through the gem's connection, Elena reached beyond the convergence chamber, beyond Ravencroft Estate, beyond the boundaries that separated supernatural reality from the human world. She touched the fundamental forces that had shaped both realms, feeling the delicate balance that kept them coexistent rather than destructive. Vladrik raised his scepter, dark energy crackling around its tip as he prepared to destroy Elena before she could complete whatever working she'd begun. But Adrian moved with vampire speed enhanced by 3 centuries of accumulated power, intercepting Vladrik's attack with his own body. The impact sent Adrian sprawling across the chamber floor, supernatural energies burning through his clothing and flesh. But his sacrifice bought Elena the seconds she needed to forge a connection with powers that predated the first vampire's creation. "I can see it now," Elena whispered, her consciousness expanding beyond individual awareness. "The original corruption that created your kind, Vladrik, the wound in reality that allowed darkness to take physical form and spread through blood and bite. The heart of eternity blazed with light that illuminated dimensions beyond normal perception. Through its radiance, Elena perceived the moment thousands of years ago when cosmic balance had been disrupted, when forces that should have remained separate found ways to merge and create supernatural species. "You want to heal the original wound," the Water Guardian said, her oceanic voice carrying awe and terror in equal measure. "Return supernatural reality to its primordial state." Elena nodded, though the gesture took tremendous effort as cosmic forces flowed through her human form. "Not return, evolve, show it what it was always meant to become." Vladrik launched himself toward Elena with desperate fury, understanding that her working threatened not just his return, but his very existence. But the assembled alliance moved to intercept him, shapeshifters flowing into combat forms, elemental guardians wielding fundamental forces, ancient spirits manifesting power that bent reality around their will. Adrian struggled to his feet despite his wounds, joining the desperate battle to give Elena time to complete her working. His vampire strength was no match for Vladrik's ancient power, but love provided motivation that transcended mere physical capability. Elena felt the heart of eternity's power reaching critical mass, the gem growing so bright it was visible through her closed eyelids. Through its connection, she touched the moment of choice that would reshape everything supernatural beings understood about their nature. She could heal the original wound completely, returning the world to purely human reality and erasing every supernatural species, including Adrian. She could leave things unchanged, allowing Vladrik's corruption to spread and consume both worlds. Or she could guide the healing towards something new, a reality where supernatural and human existence enhanced each other rather than existing in perpetual conflict. The third option required sacrifice that would fundamentally change her own nature, binding her permanently to the forces that maintained balance between worlds. She would become something beyond human or hunter, a guardian whose existence ensured peaceful coexistence, but who could never again live a simple life. Elena looked across the battle-torn chamber at Adrian, seeing love and trust in his expression, despite the cosmic forces threatening to tear reality apart around them. He understood what she was choosing, understood that their future together would be different from anything either had imagined. But it would be a future where love transcended the boundaries between species, where their children could grow up in a world where supernatural and human communities worked together rather than hiding from each other, where the Morrison bloodline's guardianship served protection rather than conflict. Elena smiled at Adrian across the chaos, mouthing words of love as she opened herself completely to the heart of eternity's transformative power. The chamber filled with light that rewrote the fundamental laws of supernatural existence, and Elena Morrison ceased to be human while becoming something infinitely more. When the cosmic light faded, Elena stood transformed in the center of what had once been a binding circle, but was now something entirely new, a nexus point where supernatural and human realities merged in perfect harmony. Her appearance remained recognizably herself, but power radiated from her in patterns that spoke of fundamental connection to forces that shaped worlds. Vladrik lay motionless beside his shattered scepter, not destroyed but diminished. The corruption that had sustained him for millennia had been cleansed away, leaving behind something that resembled the person he might have been before darkness claimed him. His eyes, no longer burning with malevolent fire, held confusion and something that might have been relief. "It is finished," the shadow spirit said, its ancient voice carrying wonder at what Elena had accomplished. "The wound is healed, but not through erasure, through evolution." Elena turned to Adrian, who stood transfixed by her transformation. Her enhanced senses detected the changes in him as well. His vampiric nature remained, but the predatory hunger that had defined his existence for centuries had been replaced by something closer to symbiosis with the natural world. "You're still you," she said, moving toward him with steps that seemed to barely touch the chamber floor. "But the curse aspect of vampirism is gone. You're sustained by life energy freely given rather than taken by force." Adrian reached out tentatively, his fingers finding hers with the same electric connection they'd always shared. "And you, what have you become?" Elena smiled, feeling knowledge flow through her that belonged to her new nature as guardian of the balance between worlds. "I'm what the Morrison bloodline was always meant to evolve toward. Not a hunter who destroys supernatural threats, but a protector who ensures all forms of consciousness can coexist peacefully." Around them, the assembled alliance members were discovering their own transformations. The elemental guardians found their connection to natural forces strengthened and more harmonious. The shapeshifters experienced smoother transitions between forms and deeper understanding of both human and animal consciousness. Even the ancient spirits seemed more solid, more connected to the physical world they'd spent eons observing from the margins. Mrs. Harwick appeared in the chamber's entrance, her expression mixing relief with awe as she surveyed the transformed space. "The estate," she said, "it's changed as well. I can feel the difference in every stone." Thomas joined her, his weathered features showing the wonder of someone whose lifelong connection to growing things had suddenly expanded beyond previous limitations. "The gardens are responding to intentions rather than just care. Plants are growing in patterns that serve both beauty and function, as if they understand their role in the larger harmony." Elena felt their discoveries through her connection to the transformed reality, understanding that Ravencroft Estate had become something more than a supernatural sanctuary. It was now a demonstration of what peaceful coexistence could accomplish, a place where beings from all realms could gather without the fear and suspicion that had characterized supernatural politics for millennia. Adrian's hand tightened on hers as full understanding of their new reality settled over him. "The council will need to be informed. Every supernatural territory will want to understand what's happened here." "They'll come," Elena agreed, her guardian awareness already detecting interest from supernatural communities across the world. "But they'll come in peace rather than conflict." The fundamental nature of supernatural existence has changed. Cooperation serves survival better than competition now. The water guardian approached them, her oceanic form shimmering with new depths that reflected the transformation. "You have created something unprecedented," she said to Elena, "a reality where strength comes from harmony rather than dominance, but such a gift carries enormous responsibility." Elena nodded, understanding that her role as guardian would require constant vigilance and wisdom beyond her human years. But as she looked at Adrian, at the assembled beings who had risked everything to prevent Vladrik's return, at the estate that had become a symbol of supernatural cooperation, she felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. "We'll face them together," Adrian said, reading her thoughts with the intimate connection they'd always shared. "Whatever this new world requires, whatever responsibilities come with the changes you've made." Even Vladrik, sitting up slowly as consciousness returned to his transformed form, seemed to recognize the magnitude of what had occurred. "The ancient hungers are gone," he said, his voice carrying wonder rather than the malevolence that had defined him for centuries. "For the first time in millennia, I feel peaceful." Elena extended her hand to help him stand, her guardian nature recognizing that even the most corrupted beings deserved the chance for redemption when fundamental change made healing possible. "That's what this transformation is about," she said as Vladrik accepted her assistance, "moving beyond the cycles of conflict that have defined supernatural existence for too long, building something better." As the assembled group began making their way back to the main levels of the estate, Elena felt the rightness of what they'd accomplished. The desperate woman who had arrived seeking only shelter had become something capable of reshaping reality itself, guided by love for a vampire who had shown her that supernatural didn't have to mean monstrous. 6 months from now, Ravencroft Estate would host the first Concord of Unified Consciousness, a gathering where supernatural and human representatives would work together to establish frameworks for the peaceful coexistence Elena's transformation had made possible. But tonight, as the blood moon set and normal moonlight returned to illuminate a transformed world, Elena was content to walk hand in hand with Adrian through corridors that hummed with renewed harmony, knowing that love had indeed conquered the darkness that once threatened everything they cherished. 6 months later, Elena stood in the estate's newly expanded gardens, watching delegates from 12 different supernatural communities arrive for the Spring Concord gathering. Where once there had been secrecy and separation, now beings from across the spectrum of consciousness moved openly through spaces designed to accommodate their diverse needs. The gardens themselves reflected the harmony Elena's transformation had made possible. Vampire delegates found rest in shadowed groves that provided comfort without requiring complete darkness. Shapeshifters gathered in meadows where shifting between forms felt as natural as breathing. Elemental guardians tended sections where their particular affinities could flourish, water features that sang with oceanic voices, stone gardens that pulsed with earth and wisdom, air currents that carried messages between distant conversations. Adrian approached through paths lined with flowers that bloomed in response to emotional states, their petals shifting color to reflect the joy that had become his constant companion. His vampiric nature remained, but transformed by Elena's working into something that enhanced rather than diminished his connection to life around him. "The charter is ready for signing," he said, offering Elena a scroll that represented months of careful negotiation between communities that had spent centuries in conflict. "Representatives from every major faction have agreed to the principles you outlined." Elena accepted the document, her guardian awareness automatically assessing the layers of meaning woven into its carefully crafted language. The Charter of Unified Consciousness established frameworks for cooperation that honored the unique needs of each supernatural community, while creating structures for peaceful resolution of the inevitable conflicts that arose when different forms of consciousness shared space. "Mrs. Harwick outdid herself with the preparations," Elena observed, noting how the housekeeper had coordinated logistics that would have challenged any diplomatic corps. sleeping arrangements for beings who existed in multiple dimensions, dietary requirements for creatures sustained by everything from moonlight to emotional resonance, security measures that protected vulnerable delegates without insulting powerful ones. Thomas had contributed his own innovations to the gathering's success. The estate's grounds now included botanical displays that demonstrated how different species could enhance each other's growth rather than competing for resources. His presentations had become models for agricultural cooperation between human and supernatural communities in regions where Elena's influence was spreading. "The children love the new playground," Adrian noted, gesturing toward an area where young beings from multiple species played together with the unconscious harmony that came naturally to those who'd never known the old divisions. Elena watched vampire children running alongside young shapeshifters and half-human descendants of elemental guardians, their laughter creating music that seemed to enhance the garden's blooming. This was perhaps the most profound result of her transformation. Generations growing up who would never know the fear and suspicion that had defined supernatural politics for millennia. A familiar presence approached through the crowd, and Elena turned to see Vladrik making his way toward them with the measured dignity that had replaced his ancient malevolence. His transformation remained the most dramatic evidence of what healing fundamental corruption could accomplish. Where once he had radiated predatory hunger, he now carried himself with the scholarly air of someone fascinated by the philosophical implications of consciousness itself. "The morning sessions exceeded my expectations," he said, his voice carrying enthusiasm that would have been impossible in his corrupted state. "The proposals for joint research into consciousness expansion could revolutionize our understanding of what existence means." Elena smiled at his academic excitement, remembering the terrifying figure who had nearly destroyed everything she loved. "Any interesting developments?" 3 different communities have volunteered their territories for pilot programs in integrated governance. If the experiments succeed, we could see the first truly mixed-species cities within a generation. Adrian's hand found Elena's, their connection as strong as ever, despite the fundamental changes in their natures. "Are you ready for the ceremony?" Elena nodded, understanding that the afternoon's formal signing would mark the official beginning of the new era her transformation had made possible. But beyond the political significance, it represented something more personal, the moment when her choice to sacrifice her human nature would be formally recognized as the gift that had saved both supernatural and human worlds. They made their way toward the estate's main terrace, where representatives gathered around tables, arranged to reflect the equality of all participating consciousness forms. No elevated platforms, no hierarchical seating, just beings of various natures working together toward common goals. As Elena took her place at the central table, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperate unemployment to guardian of interdimensional harmony. The rain-soaked woman who had begged for work in the barn had become something capable of reshaping reality itself, but the core of who she was remained unchanged, someone who protected what she loved and fought for those who needed her strength. The charter signing proceeded with ceremonial dignity appropriate to its historical significance. Each representative added their mark to the document using methods that reflected their nature, some with traditional ink, others with energy signatures that glowed against the parchment, still others with symbols that existed in dimensions beyond normal perception. When Elena's turn came, she pressed her palm against the document and watched as light flowed from her guardian nature to seal the agreements with bonds that transcended mere legal obligation. The charter would endure because it was woven into the fabric of reality itself, protected by the same forces that maintained balance between worlds. As sunset painted the estate in colors that seemed to come from multiple dimensions simultaneously, Elena stood with Adrian on the terrace, overlooking their transformed domain. Guests from dozen communities mingled in gardens where harmony had replaced conflict. Children played in spaces designed for beings who would never know the old fears, and the future stretched ahead with possibilities that would have been unimaginable just months earlier. "No regrets?" Adrian asked, his voice carrying the love that had anchored her through every transformation. Elena leaned against him, feeling the rightness of choosing love over simplicity, responsibility over safety, and hope over despair. None whatsoever. This is exactly where I belong. The estate settled around them like protective arms, and Elena realized that her desperate plea for shelter had been answered in ways she never could have imagined. She had found not just a place to sleep, but a home worth reshaping worlds to protect.